All right, when you hear the name Cleopatra, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably this legendary queen, this seductress who had the great Roman general Mark Antony completely wrapped around her finger, right? Well, what if I told you that's just a tiny, polished piece of a much, much messier and frankly, more brutal story? See, behind the scenes, the fight for Antony's empire wasn't just a love affair. It was a vicious three-way war fought by some of the most powerful women in the entire ancient world. So, how well do you really think you know this story? Because this wasn't just a romance. Oh no, this was a full-blown war. And the weapons they used, they were, well, truly shocking. I'm talking about a wife who took revenge on a dead man's tongue with her hairpins. Another who literally weaponized being a good person. And battlefields where the ammunition wasn't just rocks, but vulgar insults carved into lead bullets and flung at the enemy. This is the real gritty story behind that high-stakes game for control of Rome.
And right at the heart of this incredible storm were three women. You had Fulvia, Antony's intensely political and savvy wife. Then came Octavia, his second wife, strategic and dutiful. And of course, there was Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt herself. Each one was fighting for Antony, sure, but really they were fighting for the future of an empire.
So let's start with player number one, Fulvia, Mark Antony's third wife. And I need you to just completely forget any stereotype you have of a quiet, domestic Roman matron. Fulvia was a political force of nature, a true warrior queen. I mean, she came from an incredibly rich and powerful family, and she was a major political player in her own right long before Antony. In fact, she was one of the key architects of the very power-sharing deal that gave Antony his control in the first place. She was smart, she was experienced, and as you're about to see, she was absolutely ruthless. And if you want a perfect example of that ferocity, here it is. When Antony's biggest political rival, the famous orator Cicero, was executed, the story goes that Fulvia got his severed head, she then apparently spat on it, and for good measure, took out her hairpins and just repeatedly stabbed his tongue as a final payback for all the speeches he'd made against her husband. So what do you think a woman like that does when she hears her husband is off in Egypt, completely mesmerized by Cleopatra? Did she write a sad letter? No. Did she wait for him to come to his senses? Not a chance. She raised 8 legions and single-handedly started a civil war in Italy. The whole point? To force Antony to abandon Cleopatra and get back to Rome where he belonged. Now here's what's so amazing about this. Fulvia wasn't just pulling strings from a distance. She was on the ground, wearing armor, carrying a sword, and personally commanding her troops. She was so effective, such a threat, that her enemies, led by Antony's rival Octavian, actually made propaganda just for her. They carved these crude, disgusting insults about her onto lead sling bullets and fired them over the walls of her city. She was a general on the battlefield. In the end, though, Fulvia's war failed. She died in exile, her gamble lost. But her death created this huge power vacuum, and a new player immediately stepped onto the board, Octavia, the sister of Antony's biggest rival. And her weapons of choice? They couldn't have been more different. You know, if Fulvia was this raging fire, all aggression and battle, then Octavia was like calm water. Or Fulvia waged a literal war, Octavia waged peace. But you should not mistake her virtue for weakness. Her grace and dignity were praised by everyone in Rome, and that public adoration, that was her shield and her sword. It was an incredibly powerful political tool in a city that was just sick and tired of war. But Octavia was no fool. She knew exactly what kind of game she was in. She was trapped between the two most powerful men in the world, her husband Antony and her brother Octavian. She saw her tragic situation with absolute clarity, realizing that no matter who won, she was destined for heartbreak. This wasn't just sadness. It was a razor-sharp political analysis of her own impossible spot. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, a third player was watching all of this unfold, and Cleopatra understood something really profound. Octavia's goodness, her virtue that everyone praised, was a much, much bigger threat to her relationship with Antony than Fulvia's swords and armies ever were. A direct fight wasn't going to work this time. So Cleopatra launched a psychological one. She decided her battlefield wasn't going to be Italy. It was going to be Antony's own mind. Her goal was to manipulate his emotions, his motives, his entire behavior, to make staying with her in Egypt feel not just like a choice, but like a life or death necessity for her. And oh, she had a playbook. It was brilliant.
Whenever Antony started making plans to go back to Rome and to his wife Octavia, Cleopatra would put on this masterful performance. She'd suddenly stop eating, making herself appear frail and weak. She'd make sure people saw her with tears streaming down her face, looking utterly devastated. She played the part so well that Antony became convinced she would literally die from a broken heart if he left. And guess what? It worked. Every time. He'd cancel his plans and stay right there in Egypt. But let's be really clear about something. History loves to paint Cleopatra as just this lovesick seductress, but this was never just about passion. This was a brilliant strategic alliance. Think about it. Cleopatra, as the queen of a very wealthy but vulnerable kingdom, desperately needed the protection of Rome's military, and Antony, who had to constantly pay his legions, needed the bottomless wealth of Egypt. It was a partnership where both sides got exactly what they needed to survive.
But ultimately, their alliance, their power, their love, it wasn't enough. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Actium, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives rather than face the humiliation of being captured. The war was finally over. The dust settled. But the most shocking part of this whole story was still to come. So Antony and Cleopatra are gone. What do you think happens to Octavia? You know, the wife who was publicly humiliated, abandoned for another woman, whose husband just died alongside his lover? What's her next move? Revenge, right? It's gotta be revenge. Nope. In an act of grace that was just almost unbelievable for the time, Octavia took in all of Mark Antony's orphan children and raised them in her own home, as her own. And I mean all of them, not just the kids he had with his first wife, Fulvia. She also adopted and raised the 3 children he had with her great rival, the woman who took her husband, Cleopatra. This was way more than just kindness. It was a political masterstroke. She absorbed her husband's entire legacy into her own family, making sure there were no rival heirs left to challenge her brother's new Roman Empire. And maybe the most poignant detail in this entire saga is this. One of Cleopatra's very last acts before she died was to arrange for gifts to be sent to Octavia. Can you imagine that? It was a final silent message, a concession maybe, an acknowledgement from one queen to another, recognizing the unique, enduring power of the woman who would ultimately outlast them all. So when you look back, you have Fulvia, who fought with a sword, Cleopatra, who fought with her mind, and Octavia, who fought with grace. In a story where the lines are so blurred, it makes you wonder, who really won? The warrior, the strategist, or the peacemaker? At the end of the day, history and what it means to win is never as simple as we think.